Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 2. I guess I can take this off. Well, the nice thing about us being online is I don't have to wear the mask the whole time. Today, I want to talk a little bit about literacy and technology. So, we're talking about computers and composition. We're interested in expanding and complicating the notion of literacy in relationship to technology. So, traditionally, literacy is the ability to read and write. Over time, it's really become a term that's about competence in whatever specific area. So you could be wine literate because you're really good at picking out wine, or you can become computer literate, right? We hear a lot. So what I'm looking at today is specifically built around the book that you're reading the first chapter of during this module. So you're reading the first chapter of Stuart Selber's Multiliteracies. And I want to talk about kind of the book as a whole because it has a lot of core ideas that have set the foundation for some of the kind of ideas that are accepted or are now part of the discourse in computers and composition. So we talk about pedagogy. For those of you who don't know, pedagogy is just your approach to teaching, okay? Practice would be the idea of that of actually in your writing. How does this impact you as a writer, as a student? And programs. So Selber's book is actually really based on the programmatic level. That is, what should programs be doing to address and combine kind of literacy and computer technology. And we'll talk about that more, right? So kind of 3 different levels of looking at literacy and technology in this brief lecture. Here we go. So there had before Selber's 2004 book, there are lots of narratives about technology and writing studies or communication studies in general, but computers and composition scholars have regularly critiqued deterministic narratives of technology that construct them either as neutral tools or as autonomous cultural forces. So these are 2 ideas, 2 narratives about technology, right? One is that it doesn't really matter what technology you're using, it's how you use it, right? It's neutral. It doesn't have any deterministic or functional value of its own, right? It's only what you bring to it. So the notion behind a neutral, looking at it as a neutral tool, is that writing with a pen and writing with a computer should be the same because they're neutral. You're the writer. You're what brings the difference. It's just a tool, right? A hammer is a hammer is a hammer. Probably you all recognize now, because you're so in tune to using different technologies, from using a pencil or a crayon to a pen to a computer keyboard to writing on your phone, right? That all of these different ways of composing, these modes of composing, if you will, do impact, right? So our ability to write and the ways in which we write. So there's always kind of been this critique of that neutral value, right? And generally speaking, those critiques have been either really harsh, right? Saying computers are these autonomous cultural forces that then are going to take over everything and replace us, right? Think about the narrative of something like the Terminator movies, right? And there are a lot of, or iRobot, right? Where technology or an AI becomes so powerful that it no longer needs humans and therefore leads us to our doom, right, as humans. To a lesser extent, right, there's that narrative about technology and writing, and that is that how many of you have thought or heard that all these kids texting on their cell phones is turning them into worse writers, right? That is kind of this idea of technology as this force that kind of overwhelms and impacts the writer, so much so that you don't really have a choice, right? So if I'm somebody who texts a lot, I'm just going to become a bad writer because that's what it does, right? So we look at these kind of different traditional narratives, and I'm giving you some references there. They're cited at the end if you're interested in reading more. But of course, there's also people who resist these narratives, right? like Andrew Feinberg, who's a philosopher of communication, who argues for a critical theory of technology, right? So the idea of is not just that technology is one thing or is another thing, that we're bringing critical theory, that is the questioning and interrogating of everything we think and believe about something, into the process of thinking about technology communication. So Feinberg's critical theory of technology sees technology as an ambivalent process, where technology is not neutral, but it's also not taking us over, right? It's a both and, it's an either or, it's a neither nor situation, right? Depending on our moments and our ways in which we interact with technology, it can be positive and it can be negative, right? It's ambivalent. It has both of those feelings. But also part of this, and that's important, that last sentence there, human action can effect change, right, in technological environments. In other words, it's not just technology acting upon the human user, it's also the human user acting upon technology. And of course, that idea comes across in the 90s and develops in the 2000s. And what we get in Selber's book is kind of the 2004 version of that. That now, as readers and writers and composers in digital environments, you guys will be able to add new layers to. And certainly, I'll provide for you some readings that kind of extend these ideas into more contemporary settings. So the book is Multiliteracies for a Digital Age from 2004, and we're in that part of our course where we're looking at kind of what are the influential ideas that shape computers and composition today as a field. And the idea of multiliteracies, and multi a lot of things, multimodal, multimedia, multiliteracies, reflect this postmodern idea where things aren't one thing or another, right? Some binaries, it's all broken down. So it's multiple, it's complex, it's not overly simple. And the literacies he actually talks about are key to a lot of the ways in which we continue to talk about writing studies with technology. So multiliteracies for a digital age, Selber draws on scholars such as Feinberg and Brian Pfaffenberger, if you're interested in somebody else, to argue that English studies students in a digital age need to become literate digital citizens, right? So the idea is that as writing studies people, we need to teach our students to communicate in the world in which they actually communicate. And part of that world is not only the citizen of the kind of real world, but also the citizen of the digital world. In other words, instead of just learning how to use a technology, that's one kind of literacy, right? You're able to use it. Students also need to be able to analyze it, right? That's that critique that Feinberg and Pfaffenberger talk about. But even moving beyond critical theory, they must also be able to approach it rhetorically. And of course, this is how it falls into English studies, right? We're very interested in rhetoric, or how the most effective means of persuasion, right? How can we purposefully make choices in our writing and our compositions to make them more effective for audiences? So what Selber is really building is a post-critical narrative, right? So he's moving beyond that critical narrative of people like Feinberg and Pfaffenberger and other scholars in computers and composition, and creating a multiple view that includes functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies. In other words, it's not one thing or the other, right? We don't need to be just functional or just critical or just rhetorical. We need to be able to be all of those things and teach our students to do all of those things to make them more effective digital citizens. So what's every research, and this is a great thing for you to think about as you think about your own research process. Every research project begins with a research problem. So I think it's helpful to kind of say, well, why is Selber writing this? Well, he says, many in the profession are understandably skeptical about getting involved in computer literacy initiatives. In other words, one of the problems he sees is that a lot of people aren't comfortable getting involved in literacy initiatives, right? Because they're not comfortable with computer technology, perhaps, because they don't have the resources they need, the training they need, whatever, right? Still others, the great majority of teachers, I would argue, are encouraged, even mandated, to integrate technology into the curriculum. Yet no incentives are given for such an ambitious assignment, one that places an extra workload burden on teachers, adding considerably to their overall job activities. Now, if you're teaching right now, in the age of COVID, you probably recognize a lot of the truth behind that second realization, and that is that working with technology, especially new technologies, is a tremendous workload burden, right? It takes a lot more time to prepare a lecture like this that's recorded with a PowerPoint, where I've got all my notes laid out in front of me, than just to stand in front of a classroom and present that with my notes, of course, but not with a PowerPoint necessarily, right? Because we can have that conversation. Also trying to kind of pre-plan in a way that I'm trying to answer those questions you might have, even though I haven't heard them, right? So when you're in a classroom, you have that interactivity that also helps, and it relieves some of the burden because part of that lecture can become discussion, right? So what he's saying is we have these two kind of oppositional ideas, right? One is that a lot of teachers are skeptical about getting involved at all, and at the same time, they're being kind of forced to get involved. So what do we do at that kind of nexus of these contradictory situations, right? So he urges teachers of writing and communication to adopt what he calls a post-critical stance. That is, moving beyond just being critical users or critiquing computers as objects. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But to make them a post-critical stance, one that locates computer literacy in the domain of English studies while operating under the assumption that no theories or positions should be immune to critical assessment. In other words, right, that we need to become active in that conversation about the ways in which computers are being used in education. So it becomes a conversation in which we're constantly involved in constantly critiquing not only what other people which technologists might believe our students need, but also question our own beliefs about what writing instructors believe we need from technology, and kind of constantly negotiating that area. And that area is what we call computers and composition, which is what the field that's grown around these problems is what we're studying in this class, right? So there are obstacles to more productive literacy practices, according to Selber. There's two kinds. The first is technology myths, right? And some of these myths are hinted at in those early computers and composition works. So computer technologies are touted as the solution to all of our problems, right? This is that idea, right? New technology solves problems, right? So computers are going to solve problems. I'm sure you recognize that some solutions actually make problems worse. Some solutions solve one problem but create new problems, right? It's an oversimplification, and it's a myth to believe that computers are going to come in and solve all of our problems, right? Especially as writing teachers. The second one, equality through computers, right? The belief that computers level the educational playing field. Now, if you teach in a place where people don't all have equal access to computer technology or to the internet, you certainly recognize the problem behind this, right? There is an inequity always involved in anything that involves objects, right? Commodities, anything you can pay for, right? That is, that our ability to access things is complicated by my money, right? And that access extends to every aspect of our lives, right? So even if you give a kid a computer at school or an iPad at school, if they can't bring that home and somebody else in their class can afford to have that kind of technology at home, they've already unbalanced the system, right? That equality is gone. So it's important to recognize the potential of computer technologies and internet-based technologies to kind of level some kinds of playing fields, right? But it is not equality for all, right? Through through technology, right? Once again, technology doesn't solve that problem, right, on its own. It can be a tool, right, to make things better in some aspects, but you have to be really careful and critical about that. Uh, Finally, computers automatically make people more productive, right? Um, Obviously, these are myths, right? They're obviously not true. Um, Sometimes having computer access makes people less productive because they're more likely to be um, distracted by the virtual world that they now have access to, right? Some people will find that it's still easier to write by hand and then type later. Some people don't have the technological skills to allow them to be productive on computers. It doesn't automatically happen, right? So these are myths, he points out. And the obstacles caused by these are that there are people who truly believe this, right? They say, if I give your classroom all this technology, then that's going to solve your problems. You should let me be, right? And all your students will have an equal opportunity, and they're all going to do so much better and do so much more work, right? These are obstacles that we hear, if you think about it that way, in the discourse around education. It's simply not true, right? The other side of it is there are obstacles um, that we could call pedagogical impediments. And that is that what is the connection, the relationship between technology and pedagogy, or technology and what we plan to do in our classrooms, right? So teachers are writing are often not consulted during the process of designing computer-supported writing environments, and thus these environments frequently fail to align with the pedagogical and programmatic directions of academic programs. In other words, where we do our work and how that software or that program or that app or that writing space, whatever it looks like, is designed matters. And it should always, our choices for technology should always be driven not by the technology available, but what we want to accomplish in our class and want our students to learn. So we need to make sure always that our choices are driven not by the technology, but driven by our goals in the classroom. I'll give you a quick example. So here at NSU, we adopted Banner, which is a massive information systems tool, right, which allows you to manage lots of different areas of campus. But it only allows you to do what Banner allows you to do. And so when we try to apply it to all areas of campus, it doesn't always fit, because Banner says, well, you can only do it this way. And they say, but this is the way we need to do it for what we need to accomplish, right? Because those systems, the system was chosen before and without input based on what needed to be accomplished, it didn't fit, it didn't work. The same thing can happen with technology in classrooms or technologies for some kind of project you want to accomplish. You need to start with your goals and find technologies that will help you achieve those goals, not the other way around. The other side is academic industrial partnerships require considerable attention, as they have the capacity to commercialize online spaces in ways that are incompatible with the goals of liberal education. And here, of course, we see Selber's politics come in, and you're going to see that politics always come into play when it comes to education, right? And here he's signaling that we need to be careful about the commercialization of the places and spaces in which our students do work. If you've taught K-12 education and you've been forced to use a particular textbook or testing program because there are contracts with large educational companies, you can see how this, just like our first pedagogical impediment, can be problematic. Because when you enter into financial agreements with companies that represent some areas really well, they may not fit in all the other areas, right? So once again, that same idea, that pedagogy should drive what we do in the classroom, that our goals for a project should drive what we do as writers and researchers. And so we should choose technology, be part of that conversation to choose technology, not have technology forced upon us, or not choose technology first and then try to fit our goals into it. Makes sense, right? So Selber's argument for a post-critical stance: in sum, if teachers fail to adopt the post-critical stance, thus leaving technology design and education to those outside the field, it is entirely probable that students will have a much more difficult time understanding computers in critical, conceptual, and historical ways. that technology designs informed by pedagogical and cultural values not our own will define and redefine literacy practices in ways that are less than desirable, and that computer literacy initiatives will simply serve to perpetuate rather than alleviate existing social inequities. Here's his big argument, right? His big argument is, why does this matter? Why should you care about how we're teaching students to think about technology, or how we as institutions and we as teachers are thinking about technology and that relationship to literacy? He's saying it is because if we don't get involved in these conversations, if we aren't active in the development of technology, the implementation of technology in our classrooms and in our work, then the results will be disastrous for our students, right? Because our students won't get what we are providing for them in a liberal education. And so that's kind of his so what, who cares, right? And you always want to kind of think about that. Like, why am I making the argument I'm making? Well, he's making this argument because he believes that the cultural values of education are different than the cultural values of business and technology. And so it's important that we don't just let them decide what we're supposed to be teaching, what they think is important in writing, but that we are part of that conversation, right? Working together. He provides a really great quotation. Literacy alone is no longer our business. Literacy and technology are, or so they must become. And this is from Cynthia Self's 1999 book, Technology and Literacy in the 21st Century, The Importance of Paying Attention. And Cynthia Self is, along with people like Selber, kind of the forefathers and really important voices in composition studies. So that's another book if you're interested in kind of the history of our field, that's another book I would point you to. But basically, this argument is the same, and that is that we as writing teachers are having to teach students to write with technologies and in technologies. And so we can either just kind of let technology dominate us and tell us what we need to do, or we can make it our business to teach both literacy and digital literacy, right? And so we have to make technology part of what we do, not just a tool we use. So that leads us to the conceptual landscape of computer multiliteracies programs. So if you want to think about it, traditionally functional literacy would be looking at computers as tools, right? Students use those tools, and the idea is that if you can use that tool, then you can get a job, right? That's, if you think about kind of what computer programs look like, that's what they are, right? So critical literacy is this idea of thinking about computers as an artifact, something you can study, right? Like a book is an artifact if you're in a literature class. But when you think about critical literacy, we're like, so we can look at a computer as something we can study, we can ask questions about that technology, and ultimately we can come to better understand that technology through informed critique, right? That's kind of our objective. Rhetorical literacy is this different move where we're kind of interested more in English studies and rhetorical studies. So computers as a hypertextual media. So computers become the medium through which we do our work, right? So not just using computers for their work, right, as a tool, or studying computers, but actually consciously thinking about how the computer is its own medium and how we might use it to produce our own technology and to produce our own writing, right? And that becomes what we call reflective praxis, and that is, praxis is the idea of practice, of using something, right? And so reflective is thinking about why and how you're using it and bringing that together over and over again. So you're developing kind of skills as a rhetorician specific to digital literacy, right? We're not taking rhetoric of speaking and applying it there. We're not taking rhetoric of writing and applying it there. We're saying there are different rhetorical concerns based on this particular new medium. You've heard the new media, right? New medium, in this case, of computer technology. So let's start with functional literacy. Functional literacy is kind of that skills-based educational approach, right? So if you want to teach grammar, you might teach them like, this is a noun. Now go on this worksheet and circle all the nouns. Well, you didn't get these nouns, but this is why you didn't get them, so go back, do another worksheet until you get all the nouns, right? You're teaching a skill, and that skill would be finding nouns, but your skill for this is technology, right? So if you are taking a Word class or an Excel class where it says, this is how you set up the page, this is how you enter this function, this is how you do whatever, right? You're just learning how to do the skills. There's no thinking about why you're doing the skills or what you might actually use the skills for. It's just this is how to use it, right? It's functional. How does it work? There's another side that Selber brings into that conversation. He says, but historically, these functional programs have really been about the needs of particular groups of people. So people who are not trained to do something would need to be trained in these specific areas. So we think about it as not only skills-based, but also need-based. What do students need? We can help them by understanding their needs and addressing those needs. So educationally, using computers to achieve educational goals. So what are our goals in education, and how can we teach students what they need, the skills they need to achieve those goals, right? Social conventions, understanding the social conventions that determine computer use. Who uses computers, for what purpose, what are the needs for those people? So if I teach at a school that has a large group of nurses, do nurses need to learn different digital literacy skills than English majors, for example? Probably yes. So becoming aware of that can help us build better functional literacy programs. Specialized discourses, understanding making the use of discourses associated with computers, right? One of the big problems that I see with my students is they don't know how to talk about grammar. They haven't had a lot of explicit grammar instruction. So a lot of what I have to teach them is what do we talk about when we talk about grammar, right? What is a prepositional phrase? What is an independent clause and a dependent clause? Those things, right? The same thing is true of computers. If we don't understand what we're talking about when we're talking about computers, and we're not teaching them the right way to talk about computers, they can't even ask the questions they need to ask to be able to have the conversations to lead to higher order ideas. They can just stuck like, I'm just doing this, this is what I'm learning to do, rather than this is what I'm learning to do, and I'm learning to do it because it's a social convention in my field. Educationally, I need to learn these things, and I can, when I have a question, ask in the correct terms why this isn't doing what I'm supposed to be doing in my specialized discourse. Management activities, effectively managing her or his online activities. In this world, everything is increasingly online, and our students do have a need to understand how to manage that work. And of course, technological impasses, using strategic approaches to confront rather than circumvent collaborative and technological problems. So we know that we need to learn to use technology in ways that we haven't always learned them. So part of that is also as teachers finding the ways to confront those problems, right? Rather than just kind of working around them, right? You can't avoid technology forever. And Selber says we shouldn't, right? Selber says we should purposefully look at our own needs as well as the needs of our students, right? And learn those skills. Functional literacy matters, he says. It's important, right? He's not saying, no, this doesn't matter. He's saying functional literacy matters, right? It's a core notion of things that students need to be able to do. Critical literacy is kind of that next stage, and that's kind of where computers and composition was before Selber's book. And we were kind of locked into looking at computer technology and the impact of computers on writing from a critical perspective. And I like to use that word. So some people say it's questioning, right? Every time you hear that word critical, it's asking questions, right? I like the word interrogating because it is asking questions, but it's also gives you that kind of more forceful feel, right? So you want to interrogate technology and interrogate writing studies in relation to technology. Think about design culture, understanding how dominant perspectives shape technological cultures and artifacts, right? In other words, why do things on computers look and work the way they do, right? And does that matter, right? These are questions we need to continually ask about the work we're doing. Use contexts, understanding how contextual forces, institutional, educational, social, corporate, are inseparable from computing infrastructures, including courses, classrooms, and curriculum. In other words, where we do our work matters, right? It matters because There are expectations that come down on us from those institutional levels, and there are expectations that come up to us because people understand those institutions and that context in a certain way. Institutional forces. Understand how and by whom concepts such as standardization, regularization, and redistribution practices are configured. In other words, where is the power? Who's running this? Who's running this machine that we call higher education where you work, or K-12 education where you work, or the company policies where you work, right? So if you're going to go into technical writing, every place you work will probably have its own style manual or its style guidelines. Those are determined by institutional forces, right? Who does that? They're the ones who standardize things. Are the standards that they've decided upon useful, helpful, good, or are they things that need to be questioned and critiqued so you can improve upon them? Finally, popular representation. So interrogating representations of computers in the public imagination, right? What does a computer in the classroom look like? Well, if you watch commercials, you can see what tech companies are selling, right? And that is some of those myths, right? Computers will solve your problems. If I give you a computer, you can teach online, no problem, right? These are popular representations, and they're things we need to constantly critique, right? And then if you've been in literature courses, then you've probably spent a lot of your career critiquing, right? Asking questions of texts. But we can think about cultural things and cultural artifacts like computers or mobile phones or particular software programs like Twitter, for example, and interrogate them, right? What's actually happening here? Who's in charge? Who's in the power? What's allowed? What's not allowed? What are the expectations? All these things are different ways we can question or employ critical literacy to think about computers and writing. Finally, Selber recommends rhetorical literacy, and this is kind of his big addition to the conversation at the time. And he says we need to basically be able to teach students the kinds of rhetorical skills we teach them in writing classes about writing, to apply them to digital spaces as well, okay? So he says we got to think about persuasion, right? Persuasion is kind of the root of rhetoric, right? So understand that persuasion is embedded in all interface design, implicitly and explicitly. So what is an interface? Well, that's the thing you actually use when you use the computer, right? So very few of us are coders. We're not behind the scenes writing the code. There are people if you are a coder, there are people who research the rhetoric of code, and I think that's just really interesting. It's just not my area of expertise. But the interfaces we use, right? Facebook, think about Facebook, you're not back there coding in, putting in HTML code so you can make something happen, right? You're using a lot of default settings that are provided to you by the interface. And they force you to act in certain ways, right? So how many times have you seen a post on social media and you wanted to respond in a way that wasn't one of the automatic responses, right? So you couldn't give a thumbs up or a heart or whatever because that's not what you were feeling. You were feeling something else. But your choices are determined in some ways by what's available in that interface, right? Originally, Twitter allowed for only a very small number of characters. That restricted and changed the way in which you could use your technology. Making students aware of the importance of not only what they're writing, but where they're writing and how the tool they're using is impacting their writing can help them be more persuasive, make better choices, be more persuasive. Deliberation, understanding the sense of deliberation as a parameter of rhetorical invention, that design problems are inherently ill-defined and require alternative forms of intervention. In other words, when technology doesn't work, can we figure out why it doesn't work for what we need it to do? Because when things don't work, if we are not technologists, we don't necessarily understand that problem. We need to be able to start to interrogate those problems and look for different ways of interrogating those problems, right? Not just the ones we've always used. reflection, understanding and practicing knowledge-making activities, and seeking critical assessments. In other words, the work we do in a digital space is very much like the work we do on a piece of paper, right, when we're writing. But it's also different, right? And these are new processes for a lot of us, right? So what kind of work are we doing online? And are we reflecting on that and making sure that what we're doing is what we want to be doing, right? And finally, social action. Understanding and promoting design as a form of social versus technical action. In other words, that changing computers, using computers, building computer programs, writing and communicating through computers isn't just a technological function. It is also a social action. There is a human part of that, right? Computers are not making themselves. Humans are making computers. We're making them for particular uses, for particular people. We're making them to do the things we want them to do in our communities, in our societies, in our groups, right? It's ultimately social. We just haven't typically thought about it in that way. So social media a lot of times seems like kind of just a transaction, but what you're really doing is you're using it as a social tool to connect, right? This is the idea of rhetorical literacy, thinking about all those other aspects that aren't technological and that aren't just asking questions, but thinking about the ways in which we use these tools rhetorically. So ultimately, Selber says all these areas are important, right? So it's not an either or, an either nor, it's an all of the above situation, right? So students should not just be effective users of computers, nor should they just be informed questioners. Although these two roles are essential, neither one encourages a sufficient level of participation. In order to function most effectively as agents of change, students must also become reflective producers of technology, a role that involves a combination of functional and critical abilities. In other words, it's the move that's happened in English studies in general. It's moving from consumers of things to producers of things. So in literature, you might say moving from a consumer of a text to a producer of a text to a writer, right? But if we think about technologies, right, we are asking our students to use and do things increasingly with technology. So we need to be producing that technology in a way that makes it useful for them and useful for us to accomplish our pedagogical goals. So the influence of this book has been pretty significant. Many computers compositional researchers have used Selber's multiliteracies, functional, critical, and rhetorical, to describe the literacy students need to communicate with and through new media. Also extending the theories beyond Selber's focus on the computer and the interface to a range of composing technologies, right? So what we'll see is a critical look at Twitter, or rhetorical considerations in Wikipedia, or the functional aspects of whatever, right? We'll see people employing those terms, those concepts, in different ways in more contemporary research. This concept of multiliteracies has become somewhat of a commonplace in the scholarship, right? Something that people generally kind of now we understand, and it's part of the conversation when we talk about things. Most scholars committed to digital writing acknowledge that writing teachers need to, quote, develop practices that attend to the wide range of functional, critical, and rhetorical skills that digital writing demands. In other words, you need to be able to do it functionally. You need to be able to understand and interrogate what it's doing, and you need to make the right choices in doing it yourself, right? That doesn't mean it's perfect, right? So there's Toby Coley has this very useful book, Teaching with Digital Media and Writing Studies, 2012, where he argues that ethical literacy should be the fourth multiliteracy, right? He suggested teachers should teach students to understand the audience's values and beliefs, construct safe digital environments for students and give them choices for digital tools they use, and emphasize academic integrity, including how to properly cite and evaluate information found in digital sources. In other words, just because Selber had 3 literacies that he thought built together really well to cover this subject doesn't mean that's the only literacies that you might consider. The idea of ethics, the idea of what's our responsibility as writers and as teachers and as students to the other people we work with, right? I love the idea of construct safe digital environments for students and give them choices for digital tools they use, right? So a lot of times what we do, and I'm doing it in this class, is I'll be forcing you, or we force our students to use a particular technology or a particular website or something like that, right? Are there alternatives available? Well, that's ethical literacy, right? It's forcing us to think about what are the needs of our students and trying to meet their needs and their desires to be their own selves and make their own choices, right? And the idea of academic integrity is certainly key to everything we do in English. And of course, in rhetoric, we're always interested in the audience, right? So thinking not only about what the audience needs, but also what their values and beliefs are, adds another dimension to the work we do. So if you're interested in reading more of this, and certainly I think during the semester some ideas will kind of click for you and be interesting to you, and you want to see more, and some will be kind of things like, well, I could leave that alone. But here are some things that I referenced during the talk. Definitely check them out. Our library has great interlibrary loan where you can get so many things digitally. So if you can't find it in our databases in the library, or we don't have the digital book available, you can request that through interlibrary loan. Our interlibrary loan is fully functioning, even if something happens, we get shut down again. You'll be able to get interlibrary loan. So happy reading. As always, if you have questions, let me know. I did this thing just to show you what it looks like. If you go to conferences, you'll see a lot of conference papers. You read a lot of articles. You see a lot of article titles where you see kind of a play on pluralities, right? And it's because in our contemporary society, we've become less one thing or the other and more kind of the spectrum, the gray area, if you will. So here we see literacy, literacies, and technology, technologies, right? Which of course goes along with the multiliteracies. If you have questions, please contact me. I'm here to help. Bye.